Publius Quinctilius Varus stood in his summer camp near the Weser River in September of 9th AD, confident that Germania was pacified. He had spent the summer holding court among the Germanic tribes, settling disputes through Roman law, collecting taxes. His trusted advisor Arminius, a Germanic prince who had served Rome with distinction, had just assured him that a minor rebellion to the west required only a small detour on the march back to winter quarters. Varus believed him completely. He had no reason not to. Arminius was Roman-trained, Roman-educated, held Roman citizenship, and commanded Roman auxiliary forces. The governor prepared his 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, for what he assumed would be a routine suppression of unrest, followed by a comfortable return to the Rhine. Varus was wrong. Within 4 days, all 3 legions would be annihilated. Between 16 and 20,000 Roman soldiers would be slaughtered in the forests of Germania. The eagle standards of 3 entire legions would be captured, a humiliation so profound that their numbers would never be used again in Roman military history. Emperor Augustus, upon hearing the news, would stand in his palace repeatedly smashing his head against the walls and screaming, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions!" The Battle of Teutoburg Forest would permanently end Roman expansion east of the Rhine and become one of the most catastrophic defeats in the history of the Roman Empire. This is a story about the fatal collision between Roman tactical superiority and Germanic knowledge of terrain, about how the most disciplined heavy infantry force ever created could be systematically destroyed by an enemy they considered barbarians, about betrayal executed with such methodical precision that it took the Romans decades to understand what had actually happened to them. To understand how this catastrophe occurred, you must first understand what made Roman legionaries seemingly invincible and why their commanders had grown dangerously overconfident. By 9 AD, Rome had spent decades expanding into Germania. The process began in 12 BC when Emperor Augustus made his stepson Drusus governor of Gaul. Drusus campaigned against Germanic tribes from 11 to 9 BC, winning victory after victory despite challenging terrain, until he died in a riding accident. His brother Tiberius took command and continued Roman expansion, extending what Romans considered their de facto, if not de jure, control over Germania. When Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus succeeded Tiberius, he even crossed the Elbe River, the first and last Roman general to do so. By the turn of the century, Romans felt secure about Germania. Cross-border trade thrived, local uprisings seemed minor and manageable, the Rhine border appeared stable. This confidence rested on Roman military superiority that seemed absolute. Each legion at full strength contained approximately 5,000 fighting men, 4,800 heavy infantry legionaries supported by 120 cavalry for scouting and escort. These weren't militia or conscripts. They were professional soldiers, trained relentlessly in formation fighting, equipped by the state with standardized weapons and armor that represented the cutting edge of military technology. The equipment tells you everything about Roman tactical philosophy. Each legionary carried a gladius, a short sword designed specifically for close-quarters combat in tight formations. The blade measured roughly 2 feet long, designed for stabbing rather than slashing. In the press of shield wall combat, you couldn't swing a long sword effectively, but you could punch a gladius between shields into an enemy's torso with devastating efficiency. The wound profile was brutal, a straight thrust that pierced deep into vital organs. The shield complemented this weapon perfectly. The scutum was a large rectangular shield, curved to wrap partially around the soldier's body, measuring roughly 4 feet tall and 2.5 feet wide. Constructed from laminated wood strips covered in leather and canvas, with metal edging and a metal boss at the center, it weighed around 20 pounds. This wasn't just a defensive tool. In formation, legionaries could use the boss to punch opponents, creating openings for the gladius thrust. The shield's size meant that in formation, Roman soldiers presented a nearly impenetrable wall while retaining offensive capability. Before closing to gladius range, legionaries employed the pilum, a heavy javelin with a unique design that showcased Roman engineering sophistication. The pilum had a wooden shaft attached to a long, thin iron shank topped with a small pyramidal point. The genius was in that iron shank. When a pilum struck an enemy shield, the the soft iron would bend under the impact. This served two purposes. First, the bent pylon became impossible to throw back at Roman lines. Second, the weight of the bent iron shaft and wooden handle would drag down the enemy's shield, forcing them to discard it or fight encumbered. Each legionary carried two pila. The standard tactic was to throw the first pylon at roughly 30 yards, the second at 15 yards, then draw the gladius and charge, while the enemy struggled with damaged shields and disrupted formations. The armor reflected Rome's industrial capacity. By 9 AD, the newest technology was the lorica segmentata, segmented armor constructed from overlapping iron strips held together with internal leather straps and external brass fittings. This was the armor found at Calcries, where the battle occurred. The design provided excellent protection against both cutting and piercing weapons while allowing reasonable mobility. The overlapping plates could flex and slide over each other as the soldier moved. Manufacturing lorica segmentata required sophisticated metalworking, cutting uniform strips of iron, forming them into precise curves, drilling holes for the fittings, creating the leather strapping systems. This wasn't something a village blacksmith could replicate. It required specialized workshops, supply chains for raw materials, quality control systems. It was industrial military production. Not every soldier wore lorica segmentata. Chainmail remained common, and auxiliary forces wore whatever armor they could acquire, often none at all. But the very existence of lorica segmentata demonstrates what Rome could deploy when it chose to equip its elite forces with the best available technology. The helmet completed the protective equipment. Roman helmets of this period featured a bowl that covered the skull, cheek guards that protected the face while allowing vision and hearing, a brow guard projecting forward to deflect downward sword cuts, and a substantial neck guard projecting backward. The design wasn't decorative. Every element served a functional purpose based on analysis of how men actually died in combat. But equipment alone didn't make legionaries effective. The real weapon was training and discipline. Roman soldiers drilled constantly. They practiced formation movements until they could execute them under stress, at night, in broken terrain. They trained with weighted practice weapons heavier than their actual combat gear, so that real weapons would feel light in battle. They learned to maintain formation regardless of what happened around them, because formation was what kept them alive. The legion fought in organized units with clear command structures. A century contained approximately 80 men commanded by a centurion. 6 centuries formed a cohort. 10 cohorts formed a legion. This hierarchical organization meant that even if senior officers fell, junior officers could maintain unit cohesion. Legionaries fought shoulder to shoulder with men they'd trained with for years, men they lived with in 8-man tent groups, men who were closer than family. This created powerful unit cohesion that held even under extreme stress. Roman tactical doctrine emphasized controlled aggression in formation. The ideal was to advance in organized lines, present an interlocking shield wall, weather the enemy's initial missile fire and charge, then methodically grind them down through superior discipline and equipment. Romans excelled at sustained infantry combat in relatively open terrain, where their formations could operate effectively. Against most opponents, this was devastatingly effective. Germanic warriors, by contrast, fought as individuals or small groups rather than in formal formations. They lacked standardized equipment. Most had no armor and carried only a simple shield and a hunting spear or axe. Even high-status warriors who could afford better equipment rarely wore armor. Arminius himself, despite years of Roman military training, understood that Germanic strength lay elsewhere. Germanic weapons reflected their fighting style and resources. The framea was a short spear with a narrow iron blade, light enough to be thrown or used for thrusting. The archaeological evidence shows these blades couldn't penetrate Roman armor or shields effectively. When researchers tested replica framea against replica Roman equipment, the spear points would penetrate a few centimeters into a shield but couldn't pass through it entirely. Against an armored opponent, the framea was largely useless unless you could find an unprotected spot like the face or neck. Germanic warriors who could afford them carried heavier spears with broader blades, more effective in close combat but still hampered by the armor differential. The wound profiles tell the story. When a framea struck an unarmored opponent, it created a broad cutting wound with significant blood loss. When it struck lorica segmentata, or even chainmail, it failed to penetrate. This equipment gap meant that in open-field combat, where Roman formations could operate properly, Germanic warriors were at a severe disadvantage. The Romans knew this. By 9 AD, they had been fighting Germanic tribes for over a century and had won virtually every major engagement. Julius Caesar had crossed the Rhine twice during his Gallic campaigns, each time scattering the Germanic forces he encountered. Drusus had won victory after victory, despite operating in difficult terrain. The pattern was consistent. When Romans could bring their heavy infantry to bear in organized formations, they won. Germanic warriors might be individually brave, but bravery couldn't overcome the tactical and technological advantages of the legions. This history of success had bred a dangerous confidence in Roman commanders. They had forgotten a crucial lesson. Terrain determines tactics, and tactics determine outcomes. In open ground, Roman heavy infantry was nearly unbeatable, but Germania wasn't open ground. It was dense forest, swamps, narrow defiles between hills, terrain where formations couldn't deploy, where columns had to string out along narrow tracks, where ambushes could strike from any direction. Arminius understood this completely. He had served in the Roman military, commanded auxiliary forces, received Roman citizenship and equestrian rank. He had fought in the Pannonian Wars in the Balkans, where he watched Roman tactics succeed in favorable terrain. He had returned to Germania around 7 or 8 AD and observed Roman operations there. He had learned two critical lessons. The first came from an ambush in 11 BC, when Germanic forces under the Cherusci tribe had trapped Drusus's army in unfavorable terrain. The Romans had escaped, but only with difficulty. The second came from Drusus's victory in 8 BC, when he caught Germanic forces in open ground and destroyed them systematically. From these events, Arminius drew a simple conclusion. Romans could be defeated, but only in situations where their tactical flexibility and discipline couldn't be brought to bear. You had to trap them in terrain that negated their advantages, then destroy them piecemeal before they could reorganize. Arminius spent the summer of 9 AD preparing exactly this scenario. He needed to accomplish several things. First, he had to unite typically fractious Germanic tribes into a coalition large enough to guarantee victory. Second, he had to maintain Roman trust so they wouldn't suspect the trap. Third, he had to manipulate the Roman march route to lead them through terrain of his choosing. Fourth, he had to time the ambush perfectly to catch the Romans in the most vulnerable configuration possible. The coalition building began months before the battle. Arminius used the collective resentment of Roman taxation and Roman legal interference to recruit tribal leaders. Romans had been conducting themselves as if Germania was already a fully pacified province, which meant tax collection, legal judgments in Roman courts, forced resettlement of populations, and the general apparatus of Roman administration. The Germanic tribes had submitted to this because Roman military power seemed overwhelming, and resistance appeared futile. Arminius convinced them that resistance was possible if executed properly. The tribes that joined the coalition included the Cherusci, where Arminius held influence as a prince of the tribe; the Marsi, who had been raided repeatedly by Roman forces; the Chatti, who resented Roman encroachment on their territories; the Bructeri, who controlled some of the areas where Arminius planned to spring his trap; the Angrivari, who lived near the intended battlefield. Historians estimate the coalition numbered between 18 and 30,000 warriors, though exact figures are impossible to verify. These weren't the disorganized bands that Romans typically faced. Arminius had spent months organizing them, assigning positions, planning the coordination of attacks. They had time to prepare the battlefield, which would prove crucial. Meanwhile, Arminius maintained his deception with Varus. He had returned to Germanic command in 7 AD as a trusted advisor, positioned perfectly to influence Roman decision-making. Over the summer of 9 AD, he counseled Varus to establish the summer camp in Cherusci territory near modern Minden. This positioned the Roman army exactly where Arminius wanted them for the upcoming trap. That summer, Varus conducted administrative duties rather than military campaigns. He held court, adjudicated disputes according to Roman law, collected taxes. Roman sources, particularly Velleius Paterculus, writing 2 decades later, portray Varus as lazy and corrupt, more interested in enriching himself than in military preparedness. Modern historians question this characterization, noting that Paterculus had reason to dislike Varus and that later accounts relied on his biased version. But the basic facts are clear. Varus spent the summer acting as a civilian administrator rather than a military commander, which meant he wasn't maintaining the heightened security appropriate for hostile territory. The deception nearly unraveled. Segestes, Arminius's father-in-law, warned Varus of the conspiracy. Segestes had reason to betray Arminius. Arminius had abducted and impregnated his daughter Thusnelda, a personal insult that Segestes couldn't forgive. He told Varus explicitly that Arminius was planning an ambush and urged him to arrest the Germanic prince immediately. Varus refused to believe him. From Varus's perspective, Arminius was the known quantity, the trusted advisor who had served Rome faithfully for years, who commanded Roman auxiliary forces, who had earned Roman citizenship through service. Segestes was the spurned father-in-law with an obvious grudge. Varus made the rational choice based on the information he had. It was also completely wrong. As September arrived, the campaigning season was ending. Roman armies typically returned to winter quarters by October, as autumn weather made military operations increasingly difficult. Varus planned to march his army back to the Rhine, to the permanent fortifications where the legions would spend the winter. The route should have been straightforward, retrace the path they had taken into Germania, along roads they had already travelled, past supply depots and fortifications that could provide support if needed. But Arminius had arranged for complications. In July and August, Germanic raiders began attacking Roman positions in the Western territories. These weren't major assaults, just enough harassment to create concern. Arminius advised Varus to detach units to deal with the unrest, which meant splitting the army and reducing Roman strength. Then, as the main army prepared to decamp, Arminius presented Varus with a new problem, a significant uprising among the Angrivari tribe to the west. This was the crucial manipulation. Arminius suggested that instead of marching back along the established route, Varus should take a shorter path through Angrivari territory. This would allow the Romans to suppress the rebellion and still make it back to winter quarters on time. The route would be through the forests between the Weser Hills and the Calcrease Hill, through terrain that Arminius knew intimately and had spent months preparing. Other advisors suggested there wasn't enough time remaining in the season to conduct a campaign and still reach winter quarters safely. They counseled caution, a straightforward retreat along the known route. But Roman military culture valorized aggressive action, and the troops themselves were eager for action after a boring summer of administration. The promise of loot from suppressing the rebellion, which Varus explicitly authorized, made the option even more attractive. Varus decided to follow Arminius's advice. On the morning of September 7th, the Roman army mustered to move out. This was also the third payday of the year, when soldiers received their salaries in coin. The distribution of large numbers of coins would later provide archaeologists with a precise marker of the battle site, as fleeing soldiers would drop their pay in the chaos of combat. The promise of loot had boosted morale. The soldiers believed they were marching to an easy victory over disorganized rebels, followed by a return to comfortable winter quarters. That evening, Arminius told Varus he was riding ahead to muster Cherushi auxiliary forces and would rejoin the main army in 2 or 3 days. This was perfectly normal procedure. Auxiliary units were scattered and needed time to assemble. Varus had no reason to suspect anything. Arminius left behind a small number of Cherushi warriors, ostensibly to act as guides, but actually to serve as spies reporting on Roman movements and dispositions. Arminius rode north immediately. He needed to reach the Angrivari and Bructeri warriors, who were waiting in ambush positions, and ensure they were ready. The clock was running. Everything depended on precise timing. On the morning of September 8th, the Roman army broke camp and began marching westward. The column stretched for miles. Varus commanded approximately 17,000 combat soldiers, roughly 13,000 legionaries after accounting for winter attrition and garrison detachments, plus about 4,000 auxiliary troops. Additionally, there were approximately 3,800 non-combatant servants who handled the logistics of keeping the army fed and equipped. A few hundred civilians, mostly merchants who followed the army, also traveled with the column. Altogether, around 21,000 people were on the march, though the exact number was probably somewhat lower due to further attrition during the summer campaign. This wasn't a light, mobile force. Each legionary carried approximately 60 pounds of equipment: the weapons, armor, shield, a forked pole called a furka carrying 3 days of rations and personal equipment, multiple pila, and tools for camp construction. The army also brought baggage wagons, pack animals, artillery pieces, engineering equipment, and all the supplies necessary for sustained operations. The total column, with all these impedimenta, stretched between 15 and 20 kilometers when moving through confined terrain. The soldiers themselves called this gear the Marius mules, after the general Marius who had reformed the army in the late 2nd century BC to make legionaries self-sufficient. Before Marius, Roman armies had relied on large baggage trains of civilians and pack animals to carry supplies. Marius had shifted that burden to the soldiers themselves, which gave armies greater strategic mobility but made individual soldiers heavily laden. Under ideal conditions, this system worked well. On Roman roads, through open terrain, the legions could march 20 to 25 miles per day while carrying all this equipment. But these weren't ideal conditions. The terrain was dense forest, the path was narrow and poorly defined, and autumn rains had made the ground muddy. The army's pace slowed to a crawl. Units became separated by increasing distances as the column stretched out. The trees pressed close on both sides of the path, making it impossible to deploy into battle formation. If attacked, soldiers would have to fight in the marching column, unable to leverage their training in formation combat. This was exactly what Arminius had planned. In the late morning of September 8th, the Bructeri struck. Warriors emerged from the forest on both flanks of the Roman column and showered the marching troops with javelins and stones. The attack came simultaneously at multiple points along the 15-kilometer column, which meant that most of the army had no idea what was happening. Commanders couldn't communicate effectively across that distance. Individual units had to react based on local information and training. The Roman response demonstrates their discipline. Despite being caught in marching order in terrain that prevented proper deployment, under surprise attack from an enemy they couldn't see clearly, the legionaries didn't panic. They raised shields, formed defensive clusters, and prepared to counterattack. Centurions and junior officers took command of their immediate units and began organizing local defenses. This was exactly what Roman training prepared them to do: maintain cohesion regardless of circumstances. But cohesion only helps if you can bring your strength to bear. The Romans were fighting in confined spaces between trees, unable to form proper shield walls, unable to use their pila effectively because they couldn't see targets until they were almost on top of them. The Germanic warriors would rush in, throw javelins, then fade back into the forest before the Romans could close to gladius range. This wasn't the stand-up battle that Roman tactical doctrine assumed. It was harassment warfare designed to inflict casualties while avoiding decisive engagement. The Bructeri withdrew after causing some casualties and significant damage to the baggage train. From their perspective, this was completely successful. They had forced the Romans to deploy defensively, slowed the march to a crawl, destroyed supplies that the Romans would need for the rest of the journey, and most importantly, exhausted the legionaries both physically and psychologically. The Romans had no way to strike back effectively. They could only endure the attacks and try to keep moving. Then, the weather turned. A torrential downpour began, the kind of heavy autumn rain that Germania's climate produces reliably. This was disastrous for the Romans in multiple ways. First, it made footing treacherous. Soldiers already burdened with 60 pounds of equipment now struggled through mud. Second, it rendered the pila largely useless. The wooden shafts would be slippery, making throws inaccurate, and the rain would rust the metal fittings. Third, it degraded visibility, making it even harder to spot attackers in the forest. Fourth, it thoroughly soaked everyone, which meant hypothermia would become a concern during the nights. Fifth, it made fire difficult to maintain, which meant limited ability to cook food or warm themselves in camp. Unable to advance further, Varus ordered the army to make camp for the night. Roman military doctrine had precise procedures for this. Even in hostile territory, even after a day of combat and marching, the legions constructed a fortified camp according to standard patterns. They would dig a defensive ditch around the perimeter, pile the excavated earth into a rampart behind it, place sharpened stakes on top of the rampart, and organize the interior space according to regulations that every soldier knew by heart. The camp that night would have been less elaborate than usual due to the weather and fatigue, but the basic defensive perimeter would have been constructed because that's what kept soldiers alive. Inside that camp, Varus held a war council with his senior officers. The situation assessment would have been concerning, but not catastrophic. Casualties from the day's attacks were probably light. A few dozen killed, some wounded, but nothing that threatened the army's combat effectiveness. The more serious losses were to the baggage train, which meant supplies would run short faster than planned. But the army still had 3 days of rations per soldier, and winter quarters weren't that far away. The bigger problem was that they were blind. Roman scouting cavalry had been targeted heavily in the ambush and had taken disproportionate casualties. Without scouts, they couldn't determine what lay ahead or how large the Germanic force actually was. The decision Varus faced was simple but difficult. He could turn back, retracing the route they had come, returning to the summer camp and then taking the longer but safer path back to the Rhine along established roads. This would be the cautious choice, acknowledging that the mission had failed and prioritizing the army's survival. Or he could push forward, trusting that Roman discipline and equipment would allow them to fight through whatever lay ahead, completing the mission to suppress the Angrivarii rebellion before returning to winter quarters. Varus chose to push forward. Multiple factors drove this decision. First, military culture valorized aggression and persistence rather than retreat. Second, the troops themselves were probably eager to strike back at an enemy they hadn't been able to properly engage. Third, turning back meant retracing 15 kilometers before they could even begin making progress towards safety, which would take days and expose them to more ambushes. Fourth, Varus still didn't understand the scope of what he was facing. From his perspective, this was harassment by local tribes, not a coordinated coalition attack. The Romans made another critical decision that night. To increase mobility and speed, they would abandon most of the baggage train. This meant leaving behind wounded who couldn't march, extra supplies, non-essential equipment, anything that slowed the column. It was a brutal but rational choice. Speed was now more important than supply. They would travel light, fight their way through to the Angrivarii territory, suppress the rebellion quickly, and then make best speed to the Rhine before their reduced supplies ran out. This decision tells you how Varus understood his situation. He thought he was facing a temporary obstacle, not a death trap. He expected to break through within a day or two, reach more open terrain where Roman tactical advantages would apply, and reassert control. The idea that his entire army was in mortal danger apparently didn't occur to him. The army broke camp at dawn on September 9th and resumed the march westward. The rain continued. The path led through increasingly difficult terrain, following a narrow corridor between Calcrease Hill to the south and marshy ground to the north. The corridor was only about 100 meters wide in places, which meant the 15-kilometer column was compressed into an even tighter formation. With units unable to support each other, command and control degraded to almost nothing. This was the killing ground Arminius had prepared. His forces had spent weeks constructing defenses along this corridor. They had built an earthwork wall along the southern edge of the path, facing north toward the Roman line of march. The wall was constructed from peat turfs and packed sand, approximately 6 feet high, positioned to give Germanic warriors a protected fighting position from which they could attack the Roman column while remaining largely safe from counterattack. Trees were cut to create obstacles across the path, forcing the Romans to slow down or detour. Ditches were dug to channel the Roman movement into predetermined killing zones. The entire battlefield had been shaped to negate Roman advantages and maximize Germanic strengths. Arminius had assembled the full coalition by this point. Contemporary estimates suggest 18 to 30,000 Germanic warriors were positioned along the corridor, hidden in the forests behind the earthwork wall, ready to attack on signal. These weren't random raiders. They were organized into groups with assigned positions and specific tactical objectives. The Angrivari, who knew the local terrain best, held key positions along the wall. The Bructeri, who had conducted the previous day's attacks, were positioned to strike the Roman rear and prevent retreat. The Cherusci, under Arminius's direct command, would deliver the decisive blow once the Romans were fully committed to the trap. When the head of the Roman column reached the earthwork wall, they recognized it immediately as a prepared defensive position. This should have been the final warning that something was catastrophically wrong. Germanic tribes didn't build Roman-style fortifications. The existence of this wall meant someone with Roman engineering knowledge had directed its construction, which meant someone with Roman training had planned this entire operation, which meant this wasn't a spontaneous rebellion, but a carefully orchestrated trap. The Romans tried to storm the wall. This was their only real option. They couldn't go back. The Bructeri were already moving to block that route. They couldn't go north into the marsh. They couldn't go south into the forested slopes of Calcare's Hill. The only way forward was through the Germanic defensive line. But storming a fortified position requires formation combat, shields locked, coordinated assault, covering fire from pila to suppress defenders, all the things that Roman training and equipment were designed to enable. The terrain made this impossible. The Romans couldn't deploy from column into line. They couldn't coordinate between units that were strung out over kilometers. They couldn't leverage their numerical advantages because most of the army was still far back in the column, trying to move forward through forest paths that were now blocked by broken wagons, dead animals, and the debris of the baggage train they had already abandoned. The Romans at the front of the column attacked the wall piecemeal, in whatever strength they could muster locally, which meant small groups instead of coordinated sentries or cohorts. The Germanic warriors behind the wall had perfect defensive positions. They could thrust spears down at the Romans trying to climb the earthwork, throw javelins into tightly packed groups, strike at unprotected faces and necks and limbs, all while remaining largely protected from counterattack. When Roman pressure became too intense at one point, the Germanics could simply shift along the wall to a different position, forcing the Romans to begin the assault again. This was the moment when the battle became a massacre. The Roman tactical system depended on formation, mutual support, and the ability to bring disciplined violence to bear in organized units. All of that was gone. Individual legionaries, no matter how well trained and equipped, couldn't break a prepared defensive position manned by warriors who outnumbered them and held every tactical advantage. The Romans died trying, because that's what Roman discipline demanded, but their courage couldn't overcome the fundamental impossibility of their situation. At some point during this failed assault, Numonius, Vala, the cavalry commander and the highest-ranking officer after Varus himself, made a decision that would be recorded by Roman historians as one of the most shameful in Roman military history. He took the Roman cavalry and attempted to flee north, apparently trying to circle around the Germanic positions and escape to the Rhine. The attempt failed. Germanic cavalry, who knew the terrain and could move through it faster than Romans unfamiliar with the area, caught Vala and his men. They were slaughtered. Velleius Paterculus, writing 20 years later, recorded this explicitly as cowardice and betrayal, Vala abandoning the army he was supposed to help command. Modern historians debate whether this is fair. Vala may have been following orders to attempt a breakout and bring reinforcements, or he may have been trying to preserve the only remaining mobile force that could potentially escape and warn the Rhine garrisons. But regardless of his intentions, the result was catastrophic for Roman morale. The sight of their cavalry commander fleeing, and then news filtering back that the cavalry had been destroyed, told every legionary in the column that escape was impossible. The Germanic warriors stormed off the wall and into the disintegrating Roman column. This wasn't organized battle. It was slaughter. Roman soldiers, many of them separated from their units, most of them exhausted from 2 days of fighting and marching through rain, tried to fight individually or in small groups against an enemy that was fresh, that knew the terrain, that had overwhelming numbers at every point of contact. The gladius and scutum were superb weapons for formation combat. For individual soldiers isolated in forest fighting, they were merely adequate. A legionary surrounded by Germanic warriors with spears and axes, unable to lock shields with his comrades, was just another man who could be worn down and killed. Senior Roman officers began committing suicide. This was the Roman military's ultimate admission of defeat, when a commander recognized that the battle was lost beyond recovery, that he would be captured, that the shame of failure was unbearable. The culturally approved response was to fall on his sword. Varus was one of them. Velleius reports that another commander, Praefectus Cyaneus, surrendered at first, then took his own life, though the details are unclear. Praefectus Egius died leading his troops, apparently choosing to fight to the end rather than accept surrender. The legionaries without officers continued fighting. Some tried to break through in organized groups, maintaining something like formation, moving together in shield walls because training took over when command structure failed. These groups probably lasted longest, but eventually they were surrounded and overwhelmed. Some individuals tried to hide in the forest and escape later, though few succeeded. Some surrendered, hoping for mercy. The Germanics did not give mercy. Tacitus, writing 100 years later about the Roman return to the battlefield, described finding the remains of officers sacrificed to Germanic gods as part of victory celebrations. Prisoners were cooked in pots as ritual offerings. Bodies were mutilated. Severed heads were nailed to trees. This wasn't mindless savagery. It was religious practice. The Germanics believed their gods had granted them this victory, and proper honor required appropriate sacrifice, which meant offering the lives of Rome's finest soldiers. Some Romans did survive. They would spend years in Germanic captivity. Tacitus mentions that around 50 AD, Roman forces raiding the Chatti freed prisoners who had been held since the Varus disaster, 40 years of slavery. Other survivors were ransomed back to Rome over the following years, though the numbers were small. The vast majority of Varus's army died in the forest or in the days immediately following the battle. The archaeological evidence at Chalcres confirms the written accounts. Excavations have recovered approximately 6,000 pieces of Roman equipment scattered along a 15-kilometer corridor. Coins, armor fragments, weapons, tools, pieces of artillery. The density of finds at certain locations matches Dio's description of places where Roman formations tried to stand and fight. The absence of Germanic equipment makes sense for two reasons. First, Germanic custom involved burying warriors with their battle gear, so bodies and equipment would have been removed from the battlefield. Second, many Germanic warriors were deserting Roman auxiliaries who wore Roman equipment, which means they would appear Roman in the archaeological record even though they were fighting against Rome. The single most telling piece of archaeological evidence is a Roman cavalry mask found at the site. It's a beautiful piece made of iron coated in silver, the kind of expensive decorative equipment an officer would wear in parades rather than combat. The fact that it was left on the battlefield, not looted, suggests the sheer quantity of Roman equipment available for taking. The Germanics could afford to leave behind even valuable items because there was so much to choose from. After the slaughter, the Germanic coalition systematically eliminated Roman presence east of the Rhine. They attacked every Roman fort, garrison, and settlement, killing or driving out the inhabitants. The systematic nature of this campaign shows continued coordination under central leadership, presumably still Arminius. Romans called their established positions colonies, civilian settlements that existed alongside military garrisons. Archaeological evidence at sites like Waldgirmis Forum shows these were completely abandoned in 9 AD, which confirms that Roman civilians fled or were killed across all of Germania Magna. One garrison held out. At Aliso, most likely the fort at modern Halton am See, a Roman force under the commander Lucius Caedicius withstood a Germanic siege for weeks or possibly months. The defensive perimeter was strong enough and the garrison disciplined enough that they inflicted heavy casualties on Germanic attackers and maintained the position long enough for relief forces to organize. Eventually, Caedicius led a breakout, fighting through the siege and reaching the Rhine with survivors of the Teutoburg disaster. This gave Lucius Nonius Asprenas, who commanded 2 legions at the Rhine frontier, time to organize the defense. Asprenas's 2 legions were supposed to be part of Varus's command, but they had been left at the winter fort at Moguntiacum, modern Mainz. When news of the disaster reached them, Asprenas immediately mobilized his forces and established defensive positions along the Rhine. This likely prevented Arminius from attempting a crossing, though whether Arminius ever intended to invade Gaul remains debated by historians. Soon after, Tiberius arrived from Rome with additional forces. The future emperor had been recalled from exile specifically to deal with the Illyrian revolt, and he commanded the mobile strategic reserve that Augustus had carefully maintained. Tiberius deployed 8 legions to restore the Rhine frontier and deter any Germanic crossing. This massive show of force probably deterred Arminius more effectively than the 2 legions alone could have, though by this point the Germanic coalition was likely fragmenting. The tribes had achieved their objective. Rome was expelled from Germania Magna. Now they needed to return home, tend their farms, distribute the loot, and resume normal life. Extended military operations required logistical capabilities that the tribal system couldn't sustain indefinitely. The news reached Rome probably in early October. The distances and communication systems of the ancient world meant that news traveled at the pace of a horse, roughly 50 miles per day on good roads with relay stations. From the Teutoburg forest to Rome was approximately 1,200 kilometers, which meant at least 2 weeks before Augustus learned that 3 of his legions had been annihilated. Suetonius, writing a century later, described Augustus's reaction with vivid detail. The emperor was so shaken that he let his hair and beard grow long in mourning, a visible symbol of grief that shocked the Roman court. For months afterward, witnesses reported hearing him walking through his palace repeatedly screaming, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions!" The psychological impact on the aging emperor was profound. Augustus was in his 70s. He had spent decades building the empire, extending Roman power to what he believed were secure and permanent frontiers. The Teutoburg disaster revealed that those frontiers weren't secure at all, that Rome's enemies could still deliver catastrophic defeats, that the expansion he had overseen was vulnerable. The political impact was equally severe. Augustus immediately feared that the disaster was just the beginning, that Germanic hordes would sweep across the Rhine and invade Gaul. This fear was probably irrational. Arminius lacked the numbers, logistics, and political unity to sustain such an invasion, but the panic was real. Augustus ordered emergency measures. He conscripted freedmen into the legions, something normally done only in extreme crisis. He brought gladiators into military service, again a desperate measure that showed how seriously he took the threat. He reinforced the Rhine with every available unit. More significantly, for the long-term future of the empire, Augustus made a strategic decision that would define Roman policy for the next 4 centuries. Rome would not attempt to reconquer Germania Magna. The Rhine would become the permanent frontier. East of the Rhine would remain barbarian territory, outside direct Roman control, managed through diplomacy and client relationships rather than conquest and annexation. This decision requires explanation, because it wasn't obvious or inevitable. Rome had absorbed other catastrophic defeats in its history and responded with overwhelming force to reverse them. After Hannibal destroyed Roman armies at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, Rome had kept fighting until Carthage was defeated and eventually destroyed. After Crassus lost his legions at Carrhae against the Parthians, Rome had continued engaging Parthia for centuries. Why not do the same with Germania? The answer lies in cost-benefit analysis. Germania Magna simply wasn't valuable enough to justify the military expenditure required to conquer and hold it. The region had few cities, limited agricultural surplus, minimal infrastructure, and scattered population. There was no significant tax base to extract. The tribes were fragmented and hostile, which meant pacification would require permanent large garrison forces that would consume more resources than the province would generate. Contrast this with Gaul, which Rome had conquered under Julius Caesar. Gaul had thriving settlements, established agriculture, trade networks, and urbanization. It was wealthy enough to support its own administration and provide surplus for Rome. It was also geographically accessible. Supplies could flow from the Mediterranean through river systems to support armies operating in Gaul. The cost of conquest had been justified by the revenue the province generated. Germania Magna offered none of these advantages. Logistics were particularly challenging. Armies on the Rhine could be supplied via the Rhone, Saône, and Mosel rivers, with only brief overland portage between river systems. This meant Mediterranean supplies could reach Rhine garrisons relatively efficiently. But armies operating on the Elbe, the next major river eastward, would require either extensive overland supply routes through hostile territory or shipments via the dangerous Atlantic coast. Neither option was sustainable for large permanent garrisons. Roman military policy was ultimately pragmatic. The empire expanded when expansion was profitable or when security required it. Germania Magna was neither profitable nor necessary for security. The Rhine provided a clear, defensible frontier. The region beyond it could be managed through client relationships with compliant tribal leaders, which was far cheaper than maintaining legions in permanent garrison. This doesn't mean Rome simply forgot about the Teutoburg disaster. The psychological wound was too deep, the humiliation too profound. Augustus sent Varus's severed head, which Arminius had sent to Maroboduus, king of the Marcomanni, as an offer of alliance, to Rome for proper burial once Maroboduus rejected the alliance and returned it. The legion numbers 17th and 18th and 99th were never used again. Every other legion that had been destroyed or disbanded in Roman history had eventually had its number reassigned to new units. These three numbers became permanently retired, a memorial to the disaster that spoke louder than any monument. The emotional impact on Roman military culture was lasting. Teutoburg Forest became the nightmare scenario that commanders feared: an entire army destroyed, standards captured, soldiers slaughtered or enslaved, the enemy left triumphant. It contradicted the fundamental Roman belief that discipline and organization would inevitably triumph over barbarian courage. The battle proved that terrain and tactics could overcome equipment and training, that even the finest soldiers could be rendered helpless by the right combination of circumstances. Yet Rome's immediate response was surprisingly measured. Tiberius, who commanded the initial response, focused on securing the frontier rather than seeking revenge. He spent 10 and 11 AD consolidating the Rhine defenses, conducting limited raids across the river to demonstrate Roman strength, but avoiding deep penetration into Germania. This was the action of a commander who understood that emotional revenge was less important than strategic security. The revenge campaign would come later, under different leadership. When Augustus died in 14 AD, Tiberius succeeded him as emperor. Tiberius's adopted son Germanicus, who was serving as a military commander on the Rhine, immediately faced mutinous legions who were angry about poor conditions and delayed discharges. Germanicus needed to redirect that anger productively, and he found the perfect target: Arminius and the Germanic tribes who had destroyed Varus. In late 14 AD, Germanicus launched a massive raid against the Marsi tribe with roughly 12,000 men. The attack came with surprise and overwhelming force. Roman soldiers swept through Marsi territory, burning villages, killing anyone they encountered, and destroying crops and livestock. The Marsi weren't prepared for this level of assault. They had dispersed to their homes after the victory in 9 AD and weren't mobilized for war. The raid was devastatingly effective, though. It's worth noting that the Marsi hadn't been the primary force at Teutoburg. They were simply the most accessible target. Other tribes, including the Bructeri, Tubanti, and Usipeti, responded by attempting to ambush Germanicus on his return march. The resulting battle went badly for the Germanic coalition. In open terrain, where Roman formations could deploy properly, the tactical advantages swung back to Rome. The Germanic warriors were routed with heavy casualties. This engagement demonstrated the fundamental lesson of Teutoburg from the Roman perspective. Given proper terrain and preparation, Roman legions were still militarily superior to Germanic tribal warriors. The real campaign came in 15 AD, when Germanicus assembled a truly massive force estimated at 55,000 to 70,000 men, 8 legions plus extensive auxiliary forces and naval support. This wasn't a punitive raid, it was a full-scale invasion designed to crush the Germanic coalition and recover the lost Eagle standards. Germanicus divided his forces. Legatus Caecina Severus led roughly 25,000 to 30,000 men on a second invasion of Marsi territory, causing extensive destruction. Meanwhile, Germanicus himself led the main army against the Chatti tribe. The Chatti, learning from the Marsi experience, didn't try to defend their settlements. They scattered into the forests and across rivers, making themselves impossible to engage in decisive battle. Germanicus responded by marching to Mattium, which ancient sources describe as the Chatti capital, and burning it to the ground along with surrounding territories. These operations were successful in the limited sense that they inflicted damage and demonstrated Roman military capability. But they didn't achieve the strategic objective of destroying Arminius's coalition or recovering the eagles. The Germanic tribes simply refused to fight on Roman terms. They would harass stragglers, ambush small detachments, and raid supply lines, but they avoided the large-scale open battle where Roman advantages would apply. Then Germanicus did something remarkable. He marched his army to the site of the Teutoburg disaster. 6 years had passed since the battle. The bodies of Roman soldiers still lay where they had fallen. Tacitus describes what the Romans found: heaps of bleached bones, severed skulls nailed to trees, altars where Germanic priests had sacrificed Roman officers. The sight devastated Roman morale. These weren't anonymous casualties. These were comrades, friends, relatives. Many soldiers in Germanicus's army had served with the destroyed legions before being transferred to other units. Now they walked among the remains of men they had known. Germanicus ordered his soldiers to bury the dead. They collected bones, constructed funeral pyres, and performed the rites that Roman military culture demanded. Tacitus says they buried the remains, looking on all as kinsfolk and of their own blood. This was psychologically necessary for the army, a way of honoring the dead and attempting to restore dignity to soldiers who had been left to rot in a foreign forest. But it was also a tactical error. While the Romans were conducting funeral rites, Arminius was mobilizing his forces. The Germanic coalition attacked at a location Tacitus calls Pontes Longi, which means long causeways in Latin. This was somewhere near the Ems River, in boggy lowlands where the Romans had built causeways to cross marshland. It was classic Germanic tactics: attack Romans when they're in terrain that prevents proper formation deployment. The battle lasted 2 days. Arminius initially caught the Roman cavalry in an ambush and inflicted heavy casualties. But the Roman infantry came up in support and stabilized the situation. Fighting continued through the 2nd day, with neither side achieving decisive victory. Germanicus eventually withdrew his forces back to the Rhine. Tacitus, writing from a pro-Roman perspective, claims this was a Roman victory. Modern historians are more skeptical, noting that Germanicus failed to achieve his objectives and retreated from Germania, which suggests at minimum that the battle was inconclusive. The following year, 16 AD, Germanicus returned with another large-scale invasion. He forced a crossing of the Weser River near modern Minden, despite Germanic attempts to prevent it, then forced Arminius to fight a major battle at Idistaviso. This was the kind of engagement Rome wanted: open terrain, large forces on both sides, the opportunity to use Roman tactical superiority decisively. The Battle of Idistaviso was a Roman victory. Germanicus's legions inflicted heavy casualties on Arminius's forces and drove them from the field. Tacitus provides the most detailed account, describing Germanic casualties as huge and Roman losses as minimal. The archaeological evidence can't confirm or refute this, as the battlefield location isn't known with certainty, but the basic fact that Rome won a major engagement seems reliable. A second battle followed at the Angevarian Wall, somewhere west of modern Hanover. Again, Romans forced the Germanics to fight in relatively open terrain. Again, Romans won decisively and inflicted heavy casualties. Germanicus had achieved what he set out to do: defeat Arminius in battle and demonstrate that the Teutoburg disaster didn't mean Germanic military superiority. Roman forces also recovered eagle standards. In 15 AD, they retrieved 1 eagle from the Bructeri. The ceremony of recovering a lost eagle was enormously significant in Roman military culture. These weren't just flags, they were sacred objects, representations of the legion's honor and the spirits that protected it. Losing an eagle was the ultimate disgrace. Recovering one was redemption. Germanicus made sure the entire army witnessed the recovery, turning it into a major morale event. In 16 AD, Romans recovered a second eagle, though the sources don't specify which tribe held it. 2 of the 3 lost eagles were now back in Roman hands. The third wouldn't be recovered until 41 AD, when Publius Gabinius obtained it from the Chauci during the reign of Emperor Claudius. All 3 eagles were eventually returned to Rome and likely placed in the temple of Mars Ultor, Mars the Avenger, in the Forum of Augustus, though ancient sources don't explicitly confirm this detail. Despite these successes, Tiberius recalled Germanicus in 16 AD and ordered the campaigns to end. The official reason was that Germanicus had accomplished his mission. Honor was restored, eagles were recovered, Germanic tribes were punished. But Tacitus, who generally admired Germanicus, suggests darker motives. He claims Tiberius was jealous of Germanicus's military glory and feared his nephew might become too popular with the legions. Tacitus also argues that one more campaign in 17 AD would have allowed Rome to complete the conquest of Germania and establish the Elbe as the frontier instead of the Rhine. Modern historians are skeptical of this assessment. The cost of Germanicus's campaigns was enormous, maintaining 70,000 men in the field, supplying them through hostile territory, absorbing casualties not just in battle but from disease and accidents, replacing equipment damaged or lost. The campaigns had demonstrated that Rome could still win battles in Germania, but they hadn't achieved the strategic objective of permanently subduing the region. Arminius remained at large. The tribal coalition was damaged but not destroyed. Germanic warriors had proven they could retreat into forests and marshes where Roman armies couldn't effectively pursue them. Conquering Germania would require not just winning battles, but occupying territory, building permanent forts, constructing roads, establishing supply lines, all at tremendous cost for minimal economic benefit. Tiberius made the pragmatic decision that Augustus had reached after Teutoburg. Germania Magna wasn't worth the cost. The Rhine would remain the frontier. Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine would be managed through diplomacy, client kings, and occasional punitive raids, but not through direct occupation and administration. The campaigns did accomplish something strategically important beyond the immediate military objectives. They demonstrated Roman resilience. In 9 AD, the Teutoburg disaster had suggested that Rome couldn't project power into Germania. That tribal coalition could destroy Roman armies with relative ease. The campaigns of 1416 AD proved this wrong. Rome could assemble overwhelming force, penetrate deep into Germania, and win battles when it chose to commit the resources. The psychological impact on Germanic tribes was significant. Rome was still dangerous, rebellion came with consequences. The client relationship with Rome, while resented, was preferable to the devastation of a Roman punitive campaign. For Arminius personally, the aftermath of Teutoburg was complicated. He had achieved his primary objective, expelling Rome from Germania Magna, but the victory didn't translate into personal power or lasting political unity. The Germanic tribal system was fundamentally unsuited to sustained centralized leadership. Tribes were independent, chiefs were rivals, and the coalition that Arminius had assembled for the specific purpose of fighting Rome began fragmenting once that threat was removed. Arminius faced opposition from multiple directions. His father-in-law Segestes remained pro-Roman and continued working against him. In 15 AD, during Germanicus's campaign, Segestes actually joined the Romans and helped them capture Thusnelda, Arminius's wife. Thusnelda was pregnant at the time. The Romans took her to Italy, where she gave birth to a son named Thumelicus in Roman captivity. Tacitus says Arminius was driven to frenzy by this loss, but there was nothing he could do. Thus Nelda would spend the rest of her life in Roman captivity. Tacitus mentions that she later appeared in Germanicus's triumph in Rome, paraded before the crowds as a symbol of Roman victory. Arminius also faced rivals who resented his growing power. The most significant was Maroboduus, king of the Marcomanni, who ruled a powerful kingdom in what's now Bohemia. Maroboduus had initially remained neutral during the Teutoburg campaign, refusing Arminius's offer of alliance and sending Varus's severed head to Rome rather than keeping it as a trophy. Now, with Rome temporarily distracted, Arminius and Maroboduus went to war over influence in Germania. The war between Arminius and Maroboduus ended in stalemate. neither leader could decisively defeat the other. Maroboduus eventually fled to Roman protection in Ravenna, where he spent the rest of his life in comfortable exile. But Arminius didn't benefit from this victory. His attempt to centralize power and establish himself as a dominant king rather than just a tribal chief alarmed other Germanic nobles who valued their independence. In 21 AD, Arminius was assassinated. Tacitus says he was killed by his own relatives who feared his increasing autocracy. He was 37 years old, having spent 12 years since Teutoburg trying and failing to transform his military victory into lasting political power. Tacitus, writing from a Roman perspective, but with genuine respect for a worthy enemy, provided Arminius's epitaph. Assuredly he was the deliverer of Germany, one too who had defied Rome, not in her early rise as other kings and generals, but in the height of her empire's glory, had fought, indeed, indecisive battles, yet in war remained unconquered. This assessment is remarkable coming from a Roman historian. Tacitus acknowledges that while Arminius lost specific battles to Germanicus, he won the war. Rome never reconquered Germania Magna. The strategic victory belonged to Arminius, even though he didn't live to consolidate it politically. The long-term consequences of Teutoburg Forest shaped European history in ways that are difficult to overstate. If Varus had successfully suppressed the Angrivarii rebellion and returned safely to winter quarters, if Arminius had remained loyal to Rome, if the 3 legions had survived, Germania would likely have become a fully integrated Roman province. The Romanization of Germania would have proceeded as it had in Gaul, with Latin language, Roman law, Roman infrastructure, Roman urbanization spreading throughout the region. Instead, Germania remained outside direct Roman control. The Rhine and later the Danube became hard frontiers between Roman territory and barbarian territory. This created a cultural divide that persisted for centuries. Western Germanic tribes in contact with Rome absorbed elements of Roman culture through trade and military service. Eastern Germanic tribes remained more independent and less influenced by Roman civilization. This cultural gradient affected Germanic political development, military organization, social structures, and eventually the migration patterns that contributed to Rome's fall in the West. The battle also established a pattern for Roman-Germanic relations that lasted 4 centuries. Rome maintained the Rhine frontier with substantial military forces, typically 4 to 8 legions plus auxiliaries, representing roughly 20 to 40% of Rome's total military strength. These weren't offensive forces preparing for conquest. They were defensive forces maintaining a frontier against persistent raiding and occasional larger incursions. Rome attempted to manage Germania through indirect influence. Client kings were appointed from friendly tribal factions. Italicus, a nephew of Arminius, was made king of the Cherusci. Vangio and Sido became client rulers of Suebian territories. These arrangements were cheaper than direct military occupation, though they were also unstable and required constant Roman intervention to maintain. When indirect control failed, Rome conducted punitive campaigns. These weren't attempts at conquest. They were demonstrations of power designed to deter rebellion and maintain respect for Roman military capability. The most famous later example was the battle at the Hartshorn Hill in 235 AD, when Emperor Maximinus Thrax led a successful campaign deep into Germania, east of the Weser River. The archaeological evidence from that battle shows Romans still using the same basic tactical system that had failed at Teutoburg: heavy infantry with standardized equipment, supported by cavalry and auxiliaries. The difference was that Maximinus chose his battlefield carefully, fought in terrain that allowed proper deployment, and won decisively. The Roman provinces that did exist in Germania, Germania Inferior with its capital at Cologne, and Germania Superior with its capital at Mainz, were established formally in 85 AD, but had existed as military districts since the Augustan period. These provinces included only the territory west of the Rhine, plus a small salient east of the Rhine called the Agri Decumvirts, which Rome fortified with a series of watchtowers and palisades known as the Limes Germanicus. Even this limited frontier required constant military presence to maintain. The irony is that Rome probably could have conquered Germania if it had been willing to pay the cost. Roman military superiority over Germanic warriors in open battle remained clear throughout the period. When Romans could choose the terrain and force the Germanics to fight on Roman terms, Romans won. The problem was that conquest required not just winning battles, but holding territory, which meant permanent forts, road networks, supply systems, and administrative structures throughout a region that couldn't generate enough revenue to pay for its own occupation. From the Germanic perspective, Teutoburg Forest became a foundational myth, though the historical memory evolved in complicated ways. Ancient Germanic peoples didn't have writing systems, so they preserved history through oral tradition, songs, and poetry. Arminius appears to have been remembered in Germanic legends, though the details are murky. Some scholars argue that he may be reflected in the Norse sagas as Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, though this connection is highly speculative and most modern historians reject it. The solid historical memory of Arminius and Teutoburg Forest was actually preserved by Romans, particularly through Tacitus's histories. These texts were lost during the medieval period but rediscovered during the Renaissance. When German humanists in the 15th and 16th centuries learned about Arminius, they embraced him as a national hero who had resisted Roman imperialism and preserved Germanic freedom. The name Hermann is a German adaptation of Arminius that emerged in the 16th century. It was probably a mistranslation. Scholars tried to render the Latin name Arminius into German and came up with Hermann, which happens to mean army man in Old High German, though the Latin name Arminius likely derives from Etruscan roots and has nothing to do with Germanic language. But the mistranslation stuck, and Arminius became known in German as Hermann der Cherusker, Hermann the Cheruscan. During the period of Napoleon's occupation of German territories in the early 19th century, Hermann became a symbol of resistance against foreign domination. The parallel was obvious to German patriots, just as Hermann had. United Germanic tribes against Roman occupation, modern Germans should unite against French occupation. This nationalist interpretation of Teutoburg Forest grew throughout the 19th century as various German states moved toward unification. The Hermannsdenkmal, the Hermann Monument, was begun in 1838 near Detmold, though the exact location of the battle wasn't known at that time. The monument wasn't completed until 1875, after the Franco-Prussian War and German unification. The statue depicts Hermann holding a sword pointed west, toward France, a clear symbol of German nationalism and French rivalry. The inscription reads, "German unity is my strength. My strength is Germany's power." During the early 20th century, particularly during the Nazi period, Hermann and Teutoburg Forest were manipulated for propaganda purposes. The Nazis portrayed Hermann as representing racial purity and Germanic superiority, fighting against racial mixing and foreign contamination represented by Rome. This interpretation ignored the actual historical evidence. Arminius was Roman-educated, held Roman citizenship, and commanded Roman troops. He fought Rome for political reasons, not racial ones, but historical accuracy wasn't the point. The Nazis needed founding myths for their ideology, and they twisted Hermann into one. After World War II, German attitudes toward Hermann and Teutoburg shifted dramatically. The association with Nazi propaganda made the entire topic uncomfortable. West German education systems downplayed nationalist interpretations of history generally, and Hermann specifically. The 2000th anniversary of the battle in 2009 was commemorated relatively quietly in Germany, without the massive celebrations that might have occurred in earlier eras. Modern German historians tend to emphasize that Arminius was a complex figure who doesn't fit neatly into nationalist narratives, that his victory was tactical rather than representing some essential German spirit, and that attempts to use ancient battles for modern political purposes are historically inappropriate. The archaeological discoveries at Kalkries in the late 20th century changed the scholarly understanding of Teutoburg Forest significantly. Before Major Tony Clun found Roman coins and lead slingshot at Kalkries in 1987, the battle location was uncertain. Hundreds of theories had been proposed over centuries, based mainly on place names and attempts to match terrain descriptions in ancient texts to modern geography. The actual archaeological evidence finally pinpointed where at least major portions of the battle occurred, and the excavations since then have revealed the systematic planning that Arminius invested in preparing the battlefield. The earthwork wall at Calchries is particularly significant. This wasn't improvised. It was constructed deliberately, positioned carefully to create optimal firing positions for Germanic warriors while minimizing their exposure to Roman counterattacks. The wall zigzags along the base of Calchries Hill for hundreds of meters, following the narrow corridor where Romans had to pass. Archaeological evidence shows concentrations of Roman artifacts in front of the wall, coins, equipment, armor pieces, and relatively few behind it, which confirms that the wall functioned as intended. Romans died trying to cross it, while Germanics remained relatively safe behind it. The density of finds along a 15-kilometer corridor tells you about the running battle, the extended nature of the combat. This wasn't a single afternoon's clash. It was days of fighting as the Roman column struggled through the forest, was ambushed repeatedly, tried to fight through, and was gradually worn down until organized resistance collapsed. The fact that so much Roman equipment was left behind also tells you something important. Ancient battlefields were normally picked clean by the victors. Metal was valuable, weapons and armor even more so. The amount of Roman equipment still present at Calchries 2,000 years later suggests that there was so much to loot that the Germanics couldn't carry it all away. This supports the ancient descriptions of total Roman defeat, not just a lost battle, but a destroyed army. The one piece of Germanic equipment found at Calchries, part of a spur, is actually consistent with there being many Germanic casualties that were removed from the battlefield. Germanic religious practices involved burying warriors with their equipment, so dead warriors and their gear would have been taken away for proper burial. The absence of Germanic artifacts doesn't mean Germanics suffered no casualties. It means their casualties were honored and buried, while Roman casualties were left to rot. The face mask found at Calchries is one of the most evocative artifacts. It's a cavalry sports mask, the kind of decorative armor officers wore in parades and training exercises rather than actual combat. The mask is iron-coated, in silver, molded into an idealized human face with holes for the eyes and mouth. Whoever owned this was wealthy and high-ranking. He brought it to Germania, perhaps intending to use it in victory celebrations after suppressing the Angrivarii rebellion. Instead, he died in the forest, and his expensive parade armor became a memorial to Roman hubris. Modern military historians studying Teutoburg forest focus on the tactical lessons rather than nationalist myth-making. The battle demonstrates several principles that remain relevant. First, technology and training advantages can be negated by terrain. Roman legionaries had better equipment and better training than Germanic warriors, but those advantages required specific conditions to apply. In open terrain where formations could deploy, Romans were nearly unbeatable. In dense forest where formations couldn't form and units couldn't support each other, individual Roman soldiers were merely human. No amount of armor makes you invincible when you're surrounded by enemies who can probe for weak points. Second, intelligence and deception are force multipliers. Arminius didn't win through superior numbers or equipment. He won through better information about Roman capabilities and superior manipulation of Roman decision-making. He understood Roman tactics intimately because he had been trained in them. He used that knowledge to engineer situations where those tactics couldn't function. Meanwhile, he kept Romans blind to his actual intentions until the trap was sprung. Third, preparation of the battlefield is crucial. The earthwork wall at Calchries, the obstacles placed across Roman paths, the choice of terrain that funneled Romans into killing zones, these weren't accidents. They were engineered solutions to the tactical problem Arminius faced. He couldn't beat Roman heavy infantry in open battle, so he created situations where open battle was impossible. Fourth, morale and cohesion can erode rapidly under prolonged stress. Roman soldiers on September 7th were confident professional warriors expecting an easy campaign. By September 10th, survivors were scattered, demoralized, desperate men being hunted through forests by enemies who knew the terrain. The psychological deterioration happened incrementally. Each ambush, each failed assault, each officer death, each setback compounded until organized resistance became impossible. Fifth, command and control in extended formations is extraordinarily difficult. Varus commanded a column stretched over 15 to 20 kilometers. He had no radio, no telephone, no way to communicate with distant parts of his army except by messenger. When individual units were attacked, they had to make local decisions with local information. The army couldn't concentrate force because it couldn't coordinate across distance. Modern militaries with instant communication take for granted capabilities that ancient armies simply didn't have. The counterfactual question, what if Varus had won, remains fascinating to historians. If Arminius had been arrested when Segestes warned Varus, or if Varus had turned back instead of pushing forward, or if the Romans had taken a different route, Germania's history would have been radically different. A successful Roman pacification of Germania would have meant Latin language spreading throughout the region, Roman legal systems replacing tribal law, Roman urbanization creating cities where none existed, Roman roads connecting those cities, Roman trade networks integrating Germania into the Mediterranean economy. Within a century or two, Germania would have looked like Gaul, culturally Roman with Germanic substrate, speaking Latin or Romance languages derived from it, with political structures modelled on Roman administration. This would have changed the Germanic migrations of the 4th and 5th centuries. The tribes that invaded the Roman Empire, Goths, Vandals, Franks, Alemanni, and others, would have been Romanized populations rather than barbarian invaders if they had spent centuries inside the empire. The fall of Rome in the West might still have occurred, but it would have looked different, perhaps more like a political transition than a cultural rupture. It would also have changed the linguistic and cultural geography of Europe. The Rhine would not have been a major cultural boundary. The division between Romance-speaking Western Europe and Germanic-speaking Central Europe would not exist in the same form. The cultural identity that eventually became German would have developed differently, probably with much stronger Latin influence. But this is speculation. What actually happened is that Teutoburg Forest established the Rhine as a permanent frontier, Germania Magna remained outside direct Roman control, and a cultural boundary was established that persisted long after Rome itself fell. The immediate military lesson Rome learned from Teutoburg was about the limits of power. Rome was still militarily superior to Germanic tribes in most circumstances, but that superiority couldn't be translated into cost-effective occupation of every territory. Some regions were too poor, too difficult, too expensive to justify conquest. The empire had limits, and Teutoburg Forest helped define where those limits were. The battle also taught Rome to be more careful about trusting client relationships. Arminius had been the ideal client from Rome's perspective. Educated in Rome, loyal service record, integrated into Roman military structures, apparently fully committed to Roman interests. The fact that this ideal client was actually the architect of Rome's destruction made Rome more paranoid about trusting barbarian auxiliaries and client kings in the future. Trust had to be verified constantly, loyalty couldn't be assumed, and even the most Romanized barbarians might harbor resentments that could explode into violence. For the Germanic tribes, the lesson was different. They learned that Rome could be defeated, but that victory required unusual circumstances. Tribal coalition was difficult to achieve and difficult to maintain. The conditions that made Teutoburg possible, Roman overconfidence, favorable terrain, surprise, unified Germanic command, were rare. In most circumstances, trying to fight Rome openly was suicidal. The safer strategy was accommodation, taking Roman subsidies and titles, playing factions against each other, raiding when Rome was distracted, submitting when Rome focused military attention on your region. This pattern of accommodation and occasional resistance characterized Roman-Germanic relations for the next 4 centuries. Small-scale raiding was constant. Larger uprisings occurred periodically when Roman attention was elsewhere, or when unusually charismatic leaders like Arminius emerged who could temporarily unite tribal forces. But these larger uprisings were infrequent, and usually ended with Roman punitive campaigns that crushed organized resistance. Eventually, the dynamic shifted as Rome weakened and Germanic tribal confederations grew stronger. By the 4th and 5th centuries, Germanic tribes weren't just raiding Roman territory, they were conquering it and establishing permanent kingdoms on former Roman soil. The Visigoths, Vandals, Franks, and others carved up the Western Roman Empire and established successor states that would eventually develop into medieval European kingdoms. But that process was gradual, taking place over generations, and it looked nothing like Arminius's sudden, complete expulsion of Rome from Germania. The later Germanic invasions occurred because Rome was already collapsing from internal problems: economic crisis, political instability, military deterioration, plague, civil wars. Germanic tribes moved into territories that Rome could no longer defend, often initially as refugees or federated allies rather than as conquerors. Teutoburg Forest remains one of those rare battles that genuinely changed history. It didn't just affect the immediate participants, it established patterns and precedents that shaped European development for centuries afterward. The cultural divide between Romance and Germanic Europe, the location of the Rhine frontier, the limits of Roman expansion, the possibility of successful resistance against Roman imperialism, all of these trace back to 3 days in September of 9th AD when 3 Roman legions were destroyed in the forests of Germania. The battle's greatest irony is that Arminius achieved his strategic objective, expelling Rome from Germania, but died without achieving his personal ambition of centralizing power. Meanwhile, Rome absorbed the defeat, adjusted its strategy, and continued as an empire for another 4.5 centuries. In the immediate term, Arminius won and Varus lost. In the longer term, both men were overtaken by forces larger than individual ambition or tactical brilliance. The soldiers who died in the Teutoburg Forest, legionaries, auxiliaries, camp followers, merchants, families, were victims of decisions made by commanders they never met, fighting for objectives they probably didn't fully understand, in a war that resulted from political calculations they had no voice in. Their remains lay in the forest for 6 years until Germanicus's army finally buried them. Some bones probably remain there still, 2,000 years later, beneath the forests of Lower Saxony, a silent memorial to the day when Roman certainty met Germanic desperation and certainty lost.